Her tears told one story. Her words revealed another. Behind the championship trophies and glamorous lifestyle, Lewis Hamilton's sister finally shares the truth that will change everything you thought you knew about Formula One's greatest champion. Fee, Old Bailey Courthouse in London, stood tall and imposing against the grey autumn sky. Inside courtroom number 3, the air felt heavy with tension. Every seat was taken, with reporters packed shoulder to shoulder in the back row. Camera flashes were forbidden, but the click of pens and whispers filled the room. Samantha Hamilton sat in the witness box, her shoulders hunched forward slightly. Her caramel-colored hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her dark eyes, so much like her brother's, darted nervously around the room. She wore a simple navy blue blazer over a white blouse. Nothing fancy or expensive, despite her family connections. "Please state your full name for the record," said the barrister. A stern-faced woman with silver-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. "Samantha Nicole Hamilton," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The court clerk nodded at her to speak up. "Samantha Nicole Hamilton," she repeated, louder this time. "And your relationship to Mr. Lewis Hamilton?" "He's my brother." Murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even though everyone knew this fact, hearing it stated officially seemed to charge the air with electricity. At the mention of his name, several heads turned toward the back corner of the courtroom. There sat Lewis Hamilton, 7-time Formula One world champion, dressed in a crisp black suit that contrasted sharply with the stark white wall behind him. His expression remained carefully blank, but his eyes never left his sister. The judge, a man with salt and pepper hair and deep frown lines, leaned forward. "Ms. Hamilton, I remind you that you are under oath. Everything you say today must be the complete truth." Samantha swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." The prosecuting barrister approached the witness stand with measured steps. "Ms. Hamilton, can you tell the court why you've agreed to testify today?" Samantha's fingers twisted together in her lap. "Because it's time for the truth to come out." Her voice wavered slightly. "And what truth is that, Ms. Hamilton?" Samantha took a deep breath. Her eyes locked with Lewis's across the courtroom. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a lifetime of shared memories, secrets, and struggles. "What I have to say about Lewis will change everything you think you know about him," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. The courtroom fell so quiet, you could hear the rain beginning to tap against the windows. Lewis shifted in his seat, but maintained eye contact with his sister. The defense attorney stood suddenly. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is making dramatic statements rather than answering the question." "Sustained," the judge replied. "Ms. Hamilton, please respond directly to the questions asked." The prosecutor nodded and approached Samantha again. "Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell the court about your childhood with Lewis?" Samantha's shoulders relaxed slightly. "We grew up in Stevenage. It wasn't a fancy place, just a normal town about 30 miles north of London. Our dad, Anthony, worked really hard, sometimes 3 or 4 jobs at once." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "Our mom, Carmen, left when we were young. Lewis was 8, I was 6 when they split up." "And how would you describe your relationship with your brother during those early years?" A small, sad smile crossed Samantha's face. "We were close. Had to be. Dad was always working, and when he wasn't working, he was helping Lewis with racing. Lewis started karting when he was 8. He was amazing from the very beginning." "Your father supported Lewis's racing career then?" "More than supported. Dad gave up everything for Lewis's career. We all did, really. Something flickered across Samantha's face, a shadow of old pain. From his corner, Lewis tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Can you elaborate on that, Ms. Hamilton?" the barrister pressed. Samantha's eyes welled with tears that she quickly blinked away. Our whole family life revolved around Lewis's racing. Weekends at kart tracks, every spare penny going to tires and engines. Dad remortgaged our house 3 times to keep Lewis racing. There were times we barely had enough to eat. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "That sounds difficult. And how did Lewis treat you during this time?" At this, Lewis straightened in his seat. His manager, seated beside him, placed a warning hand on his arm. Samantha hesitated. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, waiting. Lewis was... She started, then stopped. She looked directly at her brother again. Lewis was just a kid himself. But he always looked out for me. Always. Even when everyone else was focused on his racing, Lewis made sure I was okay. Lewis's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Hamilton," the prosecutor said, her tone sharpening. "That's not what you told investigators last month, is it?" A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Lewis's manager whispered something urgently in his ear. But Lewis shook his head, eyes still fixed on his sister. "I told them," Samantha began, then stopped again. Her hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water beside her. "I told them what I thought they wanted to hear." "So you lied to investigators?" "Objection!" shouted the defense attorney. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Overruled," said the judge. "The witness will answer the question." Samantha's gaze dropped to her hands. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth." "And what is the whole truth, Ms. Hamilton?" The prosecutor's voice was quiet now, but it filled the courtroom. Samantha looked up, tears streaming freely down her face now. "The truth is that what Lewis did..." Her voice broke completely. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Lewis suddenly stood, drawing every eye in the room. His face showed an emotion no one had ever seen from the usually controlled champion. "Your Honor," the defense attorney interjected quickly, "we request a brief recess." The judge studied Lewis, then Samantha, then nodded. "The court will recess for 15 minutes. As the bailiff approached to escort Samantha from the witness stand, she locked eyes with Lewis one final time and whispered something that only the people in the front row could hear. Whatever she said caused Lewis to freeze in place, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked strangely like relief. The 15-minute recess stretched to 30, then 45 minutes. When the court finally reconvened, the tension had only grown thicker. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads, speculating about what might have transpired during the break. Lewis Hamilton had returned to his seat, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Only those who knew him well would recognize the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a tell he'd had since childhood, when he was trying to control his emotions. As Samantha took the stand again, the judge addressed the courtroom. "I remind everyone present that this is a court of law, not a spectacle. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal." He turned to Samantha. "Ms. Hamilton, you may continue." The prosecutor approached again. "Ms. Hamilton, let's go back to your childhood in Stevenage. Tell us about those early years with your brother." Samantha nodded, more composed now. "Stevenage wasn't fancy. We lived in a council house on Peartree Way. It was small, 3 bedrooms. For us, Dad, and our half-brother Nicholas, who came along later, She smiled faintly at a memory. Louis and I shared a room until I was about 7. We had bunk beds. Louis always let me have the top bunk because I was afraid of monsters under the bed. Louis's expression softened slightly at this detail. Our dad worked constantly, Samantha continued, as a British Rail employee, then as an IT manager, and he even set up his own computer company later. But in the beginning, he also worked as a dishwasher, delivering pizzas, anything to make extra money. And this money went toward, prompted the prosecutor. Racing, Samantha said simply. Always racing. Louis started at Rye House Kart Circuit when he was 8. I remember the first time Dad took us there. Louis couldn't even reach the pedals properly, but he refused to give up. She looked down at her hands, lost in the memory. Every weekend was the same. We'd pack up the old van Dad bought. He called it the motorhome, even though it was just an old van with our stuff crammed inside. We'd drive to whatever kart track was hosting a race that weekend. And what was your role in all this? The prosecutor asked. I was just there, watching. Sometimes Dad would let me help clean the cart or hand tools to him while he worked on the engine. Samantha's voice grew quieter. Mostly, I just tried to stay out of the way. Was that difficult? Samantha hesitated. Sometimes, Dad's attention was always on Louis. It had to be. Racing is demanding that way. But she looked directly at Louis. Louis always made time for me. Even after a big win or a disappointing loss, he'd find me in the crowd and ask if I'd watched him, if I'd seen that overtake he did in the third corner. The prosecutor nodded. Let's talk about your father's approach to Louis's racing career. How would you characterize it? At this, Louis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His manager whispered something to him, but he shook his head slightly. Dad was... Samantha searched for the right word. Intense. He believed in Louis completely, but he pushed him hard. Really hard. Can you give an example? There was this one race at Buckmore Park. Louis was maybe 10. He finished second, and Dad wouldn't speak to him the whole drive home. Just silence. Louis cried in our bedroom that night. Louis looked down, his jaw tight. But the next morning, Samantha continued. Louis was up at 5 a.m., doing push-ups beside his bed. Dad had told him once that the fittest driver wins, so Louis made himself the fittest. She looked at her brother with unmistakable pride. That was always Louis. If Dad said he needed to be better at something, Louis would work at it until he mastered it. And how did this intense focus on Louis's career affect you? Samantha swallowed hard. I missed a lot of school events because we were traveling for races. I didn't really have friends over because our house was basically a racing workshop. The garage was full of kart parts. The living room had trophies everywhere. Did you resent this? Objection, called the defense attorney. Counsel is leading the witness. Sustained, said the judge. Rephrase your question. The prosecutor nodded. How did you feel about the family's focus on Louis's racing? Samantha took a deep breath. I was proud of Louis. Always have been. But yes, sometimes I felt invisible. Like I only mattered as Lewis Hamilton's sister, not as Samantha. Louis's eyes never left his sister. Something like regret crossed his face. Our mother, Carmen, left when we were young, Samantha continued unprompted. She lived about 20 minutes away. I split my time between her house and Dad's after they separated. Louis stayed mainly with Dad because of the racing. Did this separation affect your relationship with Louis? Not right away. We were still close. But as Louis got better, as he started winning bigger races, he was away more. and I was with Mum more. She looked down. We started to live different lives. Tell us about Lewis's early success. Samantha smiled genuinely now. He was amazing. By 12, he was British karting champion. By 13, he'd signed with McLaren's Young Driver program. Her voice filled with a mix of pride and something else. Perhaps wistfulness. I remember the day Ron Dennis called our house. Dad answered, and his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Ron Dennis being the head of McLaren Formula One team at that time, clarified the prosecutor. Yes, Lewis had met him 2 years earlier at an awards ceremony. Lewis went right up to him, this 10-year-old boy approaching one of the most powerful men in motorsport, and said, "One day, I'm going to race for you." And Ron had smiled and said, "Call me in 9 years." Samantha shook her head in wonder. Lewis did it in 7. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the story many had heard before, but never from this perspective. After the McLaren deal, everything changed, Samantha continued. Suddenly, Lewis wasn't just my brother. He was McLaren's rising star. We had money for the first time. Not a lot, but enough that Dad didn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. And how did Lewis handle this change in circumstances? He didn't change, Samantha said firmly. That's the thing about Lewis that people don't understand. Fame never changed who he was with me. He still called me Sammy, still asked about my school projects. Even when he started winning Formula Renault races and his face was in racing magazines, he was still just my brother. Lewis's expression had softened completely now, the mask of the reserved champion momentarily set aside as he listened to his sister's words. But there was a change in the family dynamic? Pressed the prosecutor. Samantha nodded slowly. Yes, there had to be. Lewis was becoming a professional athlete. Everything became more serious, more structured. Dad became even more protective of Lewis, more controlling of his time and who had access to him. Including you? Samantha's eyes met Lewis's across the courtroom. Yes, she whispered, including me. The prosecutor paced slowly in front of the witness stand, letting Samantha's last words hang in the air. Can you elaborate on how your father's protective nature affected your relationship with Lewis? Samantha straightened her shoulders. As Lewis moved up in racing, Dad created what he called the bubble. It was meant to protect Lewis from distractions, from people who might take advantage of him. But that bubble kept getting smaller. And you found yourself outside this bubble? The prosecutor asked. Not completely. Never completely. Samantha glanced at Lewis, who was listening intently. But there were rules. Don't bother Lewis before a race. Don't talk about normal teenage things that might distract him. Don't bring friends around who might be too excited about having a racing star as a brother. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Hamilton, how old were you both during this time? Lewis was 15, 16 by then. I was 13, 14. Samantha twisted a tissue in her hands. The age when you really need your family close. Continue, the judge said softly. While Lewis was traveling to Formula Renault races across Europe, I was usually at home with Mum or staying with Dad and Nicholas. Lewis would call when he could, but it wasn't the same. She blinked quickly. I watched my brother become a star, on TV screens and in magazines, just like everyone else did. Lewis shifted in his seat, emotion visible on his usually composed face. When Lewis moved up to Formula 3, McLaren increased their support. He was 17 then. The team provided more resources, more coaching. Dad still managed everything, but now there were team personnel involved too. Was there financial strain during this period? the prosecutor asked. Always, Samantha replied firmly. Even with McLaren's support, there were still costs. Racing is incredibly expensive. Dad had to get second mortgages, loans. Sometimes we didn't know if we'd make it to the next race weekend. She looked directly at Lewis again. Lewis knew this. He felt the pressure of it every day. He'd tell me, "I have to win, Sammy. Dad's given up everything." How did Lewis handle this pressure? Better than anyone I've ever known, Samantha said, her voice warming with pride. He'd get so focused before races. Sometimes he wouldn't speak to anyone for hours. He'd just sit with his headphones on, visualizing every corner, every overtake. The courtroom remained silent, captivated by this intimate glimpse into the champion's early years. "There's a memory I have," Samantha continued unprompted. Lewis was racing at Brands Hatch in Formula Renault. It was pouring rain, typical English weather. Everyone was struggling to keep their cars on track. But Lewis was flying, like the rain was his friend. She smiled at the memory. After he won, I overheard one of the other dads say, "That Hamilton boy has a gift." The prosecutor nodded. "What sacrifices did you personally make for your brother's career?" Samantha hesitated. "I never saw it as sacrifice at the time. It was just our life. But looking back, I missed school trips because the money went to racing. I didn't have birthday parties some years. I learned to be independent early because everyone was focused on Lewis." Lewis's manager whispered something to him urgently, but Lewis silenced him with a gesture, never taking his eyes off his sister. "The hardest part wasn't the material things, though," Samantha continued. "It was feeling like my accomplishments didn't matter as much. I got straight A's one term, and Dad just nodded and went back to working on racing finances. That same week, Lewis had a second-place finish, and Dad took him out to celebrate." "Did you resent Lewis for this?" the prosecutor asked carefully. "No," Samantha said firmly, meeting Lewis's gaze across the courtroom. "Never Lewis. He always made time. For me when he could. He'd bring me little gifts from the places he raced. A keychain from Spa, a postcard from Monza. And he'd really listen when I talked about school or friends." She dabbed at her eyes with the crumpled tissue. "One time, I had a dance recital, the same weekend as one of his races. Dad was with Lewis, of course, and Mom had to work. Lewis recorded a video message wishing me luck and had Dad send it to me. He was only 16 himself, but he remembered what mattered to me." The prosecutor approached the witness stand. "Ms. Hamilton, would you say your family made extraordinary sacrifices for Lewis's career?" "Yes," Samantha nodded firmly. "Dad gave up any chance at a normal life. He lived and breathed Lewis's racing career. Nicholas, our younger brother, who has cerebral palsy, learned to be independent because Dad's attention was on Lewis. And Mom supported from a distance as best she could." "And what about Lewis? What sacrifices did he make?" "Everything," Samantha said, her voice cracking with emotion. "His childhood, normal teenage experiences. He couldn't go to parties, couldn't hang out with friends without thinking about how it might affect his racing. He carried the weight of all our sacrifices on his shoulders every time he got in a car." The courtroom was utterly silent now, many spectators visibly moved by Samantha's testimony. "There's something people don't understand about Lewis," Samantha said, looking directly at her brother. "Behind the confidence, behind the victories, there's always been this fear of letting everyone down, of making all those sacrifices worthless." Lewis's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a sight so unexpected from the famously controlled champion that several reporters leaned forward in their seats. "Last question for this section," the prosecutor said gently. "Do you believe these early years shaped the Lewis Hamilton the world knows today?" Samantha nodded slowly. "Lewis learned early that nothing comes easy, that you have to work harder than everyone else, that you have to be perfect, because one mistake could end everything." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But he also learned loyalty. Dad showed him that by giving everything to Lewis's dream. And Lewis has never forgotten it." She looked directly at Lewis again. "That's who my brother is, the most loyal, determined person I've ever known. And that's why what happened later hurt so much." The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time for a brief recess before we move on to Mr. Hamilton's early professional career." The judge nodded. "Court will recess for 20 minutes. As Samantha stepped down from the witness stand, Lewis rose from his seat. Their eyes met across the courtroom, a lifetime of shared struggles silently acknowledged between them. When court resumed after the recess, the tension in the room had shifted. Several journalists who had arrived expecting scandal now scribbled, notes with a different focus: the human story behind the racing legend. Lewis had returned to his seat, his expression guarded once more, but his eyes remained fixed on his sister as she took the stand again. The prosecutor approached with a stack of newspapers. "Ms. Hamilton, I'd like to move on to your brother's entry into Formula One. But first, can you tell the court about Lewis's journey through the junior racing categories?" Samantha nodded. After Formula Renault, Lewis moved to Formula 3 in 2005. He was 20 years old and already being talked about as a future star. She smiled faintly. He won the Formula 3 championship that year, 15 wins in 20 races. "And where were you during this time?" "I was 18, finishing school. I'd go to races when I could, but it was getting harder." Lewis was racing all over Europe. The prosecutor handed Samantha a newspaper. "This is from 2006, when Lewis was racing in GP2, the category just below Formula One. Can you read the headline?" Samantha glanced at it. "Hamilton, the next British champion?" she read aloud. "How did this kind of attention affect Lewis and your family?" "It was a lot of pressure," Samantha said. "Lewis was still just a young man. But suddenly, everyone had these huge expectations. Dad tried to shield him from it, but it was impossible. Reporters started calling our house. People recognized Lewis in shops." "And how did Lewis handle this? Growing fame?" "He focused on racing. Always the racing." Samantha set the newspaper aside. "That's something people don't understand about Lewis. The fame, the attention, he never sought it out. He just wanted to race, to be the best driver he could be." Lewis nodded almost imperceptibly from his seat. "Then came 2007, the prosecutor prompted. "Yes, McLaren announced Lewis would drive for them in Formula One alongside Fernando Alonso, who was the reigning world champion." Samantha shook her head in wonder. "I remember watching the announcement on TV. My brother, who I'd seen crying after losing a go-kart race, was now sitting next to Ron Dennis in McLaren team gear, talking to the world's press." "How did your relationship change once Lewis became a Formula One driver?" Samantha hesitated. "It became different. Lewis was suddenly this public figure. He couldn't just call me whenever he wanted. His time was scheduled down to the minute. Team meetings, sponsor events, training sessions." She looked down at her hands. "We used to text every day, but now days would pass between messages. It wasn't his fault. His life had changed completely." "Tell us about his first Formula One race." A proud smile spread across Samantha's face. "Australia, March 2007. Lewis qualified fourth and finished third in his very first race. I watched it with Mum at her house. We were screaming at the TV. She laughed softly at the memory. Lewis called us right after the podium ceremony. Even with all the chaos around him, he called us first. The prosecutor nodded. And as the 2007 season progressed, Lewis kept getting podiums, race after race. Everyone was shocked. A rookie wasn't supposed to be this good. By mid-season, he was leading the championship. Samantha's eyes shone with pride. I went to the British Grand Prix at Silverstone that year. The crowd went crazy for him. Thousands of people chanting his name, my brother. But the 2007 season ended with disappointment, correct? Samantha's smile faded. Yes, Lewis lost the championship by 1 point in the final race. He'd been leading the whole season, but things fell apart at the end. How did he handle that setback? Privately, he was devastated. I stayed with him the night after that final race in Brazil. He barely said a word, just stared out the window of his hotel room. Samantha's voice softened. But publicly, he was gracious, said all the right things. Dad had taught him well. Never show weakness, never make excuses. Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then came 2008. The prosecutor continued. The LQ. Next season, yes. Samantha nodded. Lewis was determined to make up for 2007. The whole season was a battle between him and Felipe Massa from Ferrari. It came down to the final race again, in Brazil. Were you there for that race? No. I watched at home. It was agonizing. Samantha's voice became animated as she relived the memory. Lewis needed 5th place to win the championship. On the last lap, he was in 6th. Not enough. We were all devastated, thinking he'd lost again. She leaned forward. Then, in the final corner of the final lap, Lewis overtook Timo Glock to take 5th place. He won the championship by a single point. I screamed so loud the neighbors called to check if I was okay. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, breaking the tension momentarily. That must have been an incredible family moment, the prosecutor said. It was. Dad and Lewis were in Brazil, of course, but Lewis called us as soon as he could. He was crying on the phone. The only time I've ever heard my brother cry from happiness. Samantha's eyes glistened with tears. He kept saying, "We did it, Sammy. All Dad's sacrifices were worth it." How did things change after Lewis became world champion? Samantha's expression sobered. Everything changed. Lewis wasn't just a Formula One driver anymore. He was Lewis. Hamilton, world champion. Suddenly, he was on talk shows, at celebrity parties, in advertising campaigns. His life became even more structured, more controlled. And your relationship with him? That's when I started to lose him, bit by bit. Samantha's voice wavered. Not because he wanted it that way, but fame builds walls. Lewis was surrounded by team personnel, managers, PR people, all telling him what to do, where to be, what to say. She looked directly at Lewis. I'd see him on TV more often than I'd see him in person. And when I did see him, there were always people around, never just us, like it used to be. The prosecutor handed Samantha a magazine. This is from late 2008. The headline reads, Hamilton, F1's first global superstar. Did this global fame affect your brother's personality? Samantha studied the magazine cover, showing Lewis in designer clothes at a high-profile event. The Lewis I knew was still in there, still the same boy who loved racing, who cared about his family. But he had to create this public persona, confident, unflappable, perfect. She set the magazine down. The gap between public Lewis and private Lewis kept growing. I think that's when he started to struggle with who he really was. Louis's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving his sister. Did you speak to him about these concerns? I tried, but our conversations became shorter, less frequent. He was always flying somewhere, always busy. Samantha twisted her hands together. The few times we really talked, I could tell he was exhausted. Not just physically, emotionally, carrying the weight of all those expectations. One final question for this section, said the prosecutor. Looking back at this period, Louis's rise to become a world champion. What do you wish people knew about him? Samantha's eyes locked with her brother's across the courtroom. That behind every victory, every trophy, every perfect interview, there was a young man still trying to figure out who he was. Someone who sacrificed a normal life to achieve something extraordinary. Her voice strengthened with conviction. And that no matter how famous he became, my brother never forgot where he came from. He carried us all with him, every sacrifice, every struggle. She paused, her expression softening. That's the Louis I've always known. And that's what makes what happened between us so heartbreaking. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time to move to the next phase of testimony. The judge nodded. We'll proceed after a 10-minute recess. As Samantha stepped down, Louis remained seated, his expression unreadable, but his eyes following his sister until she disappeared through the side door. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The morning's revelations had painted a more complex picture of Lewis Hamilton than most had expected. Several spectators who had arrived hoping for scandal now leaned forward with genuine interest in this family's story. Samantha returned to the witness stand, smoothing her blazer, nervously. The prosecutor approached with a different demeanor, her voice gentler than before. Ms. Hamilton, let's move to 2010. A significant change occurred in your brother's professional life that year, correct? Samantha nodded. Yes, Louis ended his management relationship with our father. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even though this fact was public knowledge, hearing it addressed directly in this setting felt intimate, almost intrusive. Can you tell the court about the circumstances around that decision? Samantha glanced at Louis, who sat perfectly still, his expression carefully controlled. It was a difficult time for everyone, she began slowly. Louis had been with McLaren since he was 13. Dad had managed every aspect of his career: negotiations, contracts, scheduling, everything. She took a deep breath. By 2010, Louis was 25. He'd been world champion. He'd achieved what they'd both worked for. And I think he needed to find his own path. Was this a mutual decision between Louis and your father? Samantha hesitated. Not entirely. Dad wasn't ready to step back. He'd dedicated 15 years of his life to Louis's career. It was his identity as much as it was Louis's. How did this separation affect the family dynamic? It broke something between them, Samantha said quietly. Dad felt betrayed. Louis felt he needed space to grow. I was caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone talking. She twisted her hands in her lap. Sunday dinners stopped. Family gatherings became awkward. Dad wouldn't talk about racing, which had been our main conversation topic for as long as I could remember. And how did this affect you personally? I became the messenger, Samantha said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. Dad would ask me about Louis. Louis would ask me about Dad. Neither of them would pick up the phone and call the other. From his seat, Louis lowered his eyes briefly. I loved them both so much, Samantha continued, her voice wavering. But I couldn't fix what was broken between them, and trying to stay neutral just meant I started losing both of them. Did you express these feelings to either your father or Louis? I tried with Louis. We met for coffee when he was between races. I told him how hard it was for everyone, especially Dad. Samantha shook her head sadly. Louis listened, but he was adamant. He said he needed to make his own decisions, create his own life. How did you respond to that? I got angry, Samantha admitted. For the first time, I really got angry with him. I told him he was being selfish, that family should come first. Her voice cracked. I regretted it immediately. Louis just got up and left. We didn't speak for weeks after that. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. And your relationship with your father during this time? Strained. Dad was hurting, but he wouldn't admit it. He'd built his life around Louis's career, and suddenly that was gone. She looked down. He'd asked me to pass messages to Louis, but when I'd try to defend Louis's position, Dad would shut down. Was there a specific incident that marked the low point of this period? Samantha nodded slowly. Christmas 2010. It was the first holiday where we weren't all together. Louis had moved to Switzerland by then. Dad said he wouldn't come if Louis did. So Louis spent Christmas with friends. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I remember sitting at the table, looking at the empty chair where Louis should have been. Nicholas tried to keep everyone's spirits up, but it felt wrong. Broken, Louis shifted in his seat, pain visible in his eyes despite his attempt to maintain composure. Did you speak to Louis that Christmas? I called him that evening. He sounded so alone. Samantha's voice softened with the memory. For all his fame, all his success, he was spending Christmas in a hotel room, away from his family. We both cried on the phone. The prosecutor approached with another document. This is from early 2011, an interview Louis gave. He states, "Making the professional separation from my father was the hardest decision of my life. But sometimes you need space to grow." Do you believe that was his genuine feeling? Samantha studied the paper. Yes. Louis never wanted to hurt Dad. He just needed to find out who he was beyond being Anthony Hamilton's son, beyond being the driver Dad had created. And how did your father feel about that statement? He was hurt that Louis was discussing family matters publicly, Samantha said. Dad's always been private. He felt things should be handled within the family. During this period, did you feel you had to choose sides? Constantly, Samantha said, with unexpected force. Every conversation became a minefield. If I defended Louis to Dad, I was disloyal. If I agreed with Dad when talking to Louis, I wasn't supporting him. She shook her head sadly. I just wanted my family back together. And what was happening with Louis's career during this time? He was struggling at McLaren. The car wasn't competitive in 2011. He was getting criticism in the press for the first time. Samantha looked directly at Louis. I could tell he was doubting himself, questioning everything, and he didn't have Dad to turn to anymore. Did he turn to you instead? Sometimes. Late-night phone calls when he couldn't sleep before races. He never said it directly, but I could tell he missed Dad's guidance. She paused. Louis has always been stronger than people realize, but everyone needs their family. The prosecutor nodded. Ms. Hamilton, as we conclude this section about this difficult period, what would you say was the lasting impact of this professional separation on your family? Samantha took a moment to consider her answer. It changed us. We learned that love isn't always enough. You need communication, understanding. Her eyes found Louis across the courtroom. Eventually, Louis and Dad found a new way to be father and son, without the professional relationship. It took years, but they got there. She looked down at her hands, but something was lost that we never fully got back. That complete trust, that feeling that we were all in this together. Her voice strengthened. That's why what Louis did later meant so much to me, because he found a way to rebuild what was broken, in his own way. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time to move to the next phase of Ms. Hamilton's testimony. The judge nodded. We'll proceed after lunch. Court will reconvene at 2 p.m. As the courtroom began to empty, Louis remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on his sister. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of painful truths finally brought to light. When court reconvened after lunch, the press section had noticeably expanded. Word had spread about Samantha Hamilton's compelling testimony, drawing additional reporters hoping to witness what many were now calling an unprecedented glimpse into the private life of a sporting icon. Louis had changed his seat, moving closer to the front of the courtroom. His manager looked concerned by this decision, but Louis silenced him with a subtle gesture. Samantha returned to the witness stand, her posture more confident than before. The morning's testimony seemed to have lifted a weight from her shoulders. Ms. Hamilton, the prosecutor began, let's move to 2012 when your brother made a decision that shocked the Formula One world. Can you tell the court about that? Louis announced he was leaving McLaren to join Mercedes, Samantha replied. No one saw it coming. McLaren had been his home since he was a teenager. They'd given him his chance in Formula One. They'd been through everything together. What was the public reaction to this move? Mostly negative, Samantha said. Headlines called it career suicide. Mercedes wasn't winning races then. Their car was midfield at best. People said Louis was only going for the money. And what was your reaction? Samantha smiled faintly. Initially, I was worried. McLaren felt safe. It was what we'd always known. But when Louis called to tell me personally before the announcement, I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. And what was that? Hope, Samantha said simply. Excitement about the future. He told me, Sammy, this is my chance to build something that's truly mine. After everything with Dad, I think he needed that fresh start. Louis nodded almost imperceptibly. From his seat. Was this decision part of Louis finding his own identity separate from your father's influence? I believe so, Samantha nodded. At McLaren, he was always the driver Ron Dennis had spotted as a child, the protege. At Mercedes, he could be his own man, make his own mark. How did the 2013 season, his first with Mercedes, unfold? It was difficult, Samantha admitted. The car wasn't competitive yet. Louis only won one race that year, in Hungary. People were saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that his career was over. How did he handle this criticism? Publicly, he stayed positive, but privately, Samantha hesitated, glancing at her brother. He called me late one night after a particularly bad race. He was in his hotel room, alone. He questioned everything. The move to Mercedes, his ability, his future. Louis looked down, his hands clasped tightly together. That was the first time. In years that Louis truly opened up to me, Samantha continued. No PR team, no filters. Just my brother, vulnerable and human. He said, "What if everyone's right, Sammy? What if I've thrown it all away?" How did you respond? I reminded him of Rye House, that first kart track. How everyone said he was too small, too young. Samantha smiled at the memory. I told him he'd proven them wrong before, and he'd do it again. And did your relationship strengthen during this period? Yes, Samantha nodded. Lewis needed family then, more than he realized. The criticism was relentless. Moving to Mercedes wasn't just a team change. It was Lewis taking control of his destiny for the first time. How did your father react to the Mercedes move? He was concerned, like everyone else, but by then they were speaking again, at least occasionally. Samantha glanced at Lewis. I think Dad respected that Lewis had made this huge decision entirely. On his own, without anyone's influence. And then came 2014, the prosecutor prompted. Samantha's face brightened. Everything changed. Mercedes had been working on the new hybrid engine regulations for years. When the season started, their car was dominant. Lewis won race after race. How did Lewis handle this sudden reversal of fortune? He was vindicated, Samantha said proudly. All those people who had criticized him, who'd said he was finishing his career, suddenly they were calling him visionary, strategic. She leaned forward. But success came with a price. Lewis was now based in Monaco. His schedule became even more demanding. Sponsor events, fashion shows, music studio sessions. Our phone calls became less frequent again. Did that hurt you? It did, Samantha admitted. But I understood better by then. Lewis was creating his own life, his own identity beyond racing. I was proud of him for that, even while missing him. Did you attend races during this period? A few. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone mostly. Samantha smiled fondly. Lewis would always make time for me, no matter how busy he was. He'd sneak me into the garage, introduce me to celebrities in the Mercedes hospitality. Her expression grew more serious. But it wasn't the same as before. There were always people watching, cameras everywhere. The brother I knew at home and the Lewis Hamilton the world saw were becoming two different people. In what way? The public Lewis was polished, controlled, perfect. The private Lewis, my brother, was still searching for something, still trying to figure out who he was beyond the race wins and trophies. Samantha looked directly at Lewis. I could see it in his eyes when the cameras weren't looking, a kind of loneliness that success couldn't fill. Lewis held her gaze, something vulnerable flickering across his usually composed face. Ms. Hamilton, the prosecutor said gently, as we conclude this section about the beginning of the Mercedes years, what would you say was the most significant change you observed in your brother during this time? Samantha considered the question carefully. Lewis found his voice. At McLaren, he'd been carefully managed, told what to say, how to act. At Mercedes, especially as he started winning, he began expressing his true self, his interests in fashion, music, his beliefs. She smiled with genuine pride. Watching my brother step fully into who he really is, despite all the criticism and pressure, that's been the most amazing part of his journey. And that authentic voice became so important in what happened later. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Your Honor, I believe we're ready to move to the next phase of testimony. The judge nodded to the prosecutor. You may proceed. The prosecutor approached with a new stack of documents. Ms. Hamilton, let's discuss your brother's championship years with Mercedes. Lewis won his second world title in 2014, correct? Yes, Samantha replied. It was incredible to watch. After 6 years without a championship, Lewis was back on top. The Mercedes car was dominant, but Lewis still had to beat his teammate, Nico Rosberg, who had the same equipment. Did winning that second championship change Lewis in any way? Samantha considered this. It validated him. All those critics who'd questioned his move to Mercedes were silenced. But more importantly, this championship was different from his first one. At McLaren, he'd been following the path laid out for him since childhood. At Mercedes, he'd chosen his own path. And how did this championship affect his public persona? That's when Lewis truly began to emerge as more than just a racing driver, Samantha said. He started expressing himself through fashion, music, his social media. The corporate, polished McLaren driver was gone. This was Lewis, on his own terms. The prosecutor handed Samantha a magazine. The cover showed Lewis at a high-profile fashion event, wearing a distinctive outfit that broke all the traditional Formula One driver molds. People forget how revolutionary this was in Formula One, Samantha said, looking at the image. Drivers were expected to be a certain way, clean-cut, corporate, safe. Lewis refused to fit that mold. Did this expression of his individuality cause tension? Absolutely. There was criticism from all sides. Racing purists said he wasn't focused. Some brands were uncomfortable with his evolving image. Samantha shook her head. But for the first time, Lewis didn't care. He was determined to be himself. And how? Did his lifestyle change during this period? He moved to Monaco permanently. He bought a private jet to manage his global schedule. His social circle shifted. Suddenly, he was friends with musicians, designers, actors. Samantha's expression became more thoughtful. On social media, his life looked perfect. Parties in New York, holidays in the Caribbean, front row at fashion shows. But the reality? The reality was more complicated, Samantha said softly. Lewis was working harder than ever, training constantly, spending hours with engineers. The glamorous moments were just snippets between intense work. She glanced at Lewis, and despite all the people around him, there was a loneliness to it. He called me one night after winning a race in 2015. He'd just secured his third world championship. I expected him to be celebrating, but he was alone in his hotel room. What did he say to you? He told me that sometimes, after the champagne and the cameras, when everyone leaves and it's just him alone with his thoughts, he feels empty. Samantha's voice wavered. He said, "I've achieved everything I ever dreamed of, Sammy, but why doesn't it feel like enough?" Lewis shifted in his seat, his carefully maintained public persona momentarily cracking as he looked down at his hands. How did you respond to that? I told him that championships can't love you back, Samantha said simply. That maybe he needed to find purpose beyond winning races. The prosecutor nodded. During these years, Lewis began speaking out on issues beyond racing. Diversity in motorsport, environmental concerns. Was this connected to what you just described? I believe so, Samantha replied. Lewis was searching for meaning beyond trophies. He started to realize his platform could be used for more than just promoting sponsors. And how was this activism received? Mixed, Samantha said frankly. Some people applauded him for using his voice. Others told him to stick to racing. The Formula One world wasn't used to drivers speaking out on social issues. Did this create pressure for him? Enormous pressure. Lewis was entering uncharted territory for a Formula One driver. There was no blueprint to follow. Samantha straightened her shoulders. But that's who my brother is. Once he believes in something, he won't back down, no matter the criticism. The prosecutor approached with another document. This is from 2016, after Lewis lost the championship to his teammate Nico Rosberg. The headline reads, "Is Hamilton losing focus? How did Lewis handle this period?" That was a difficult year, Samantha acknowledged. Lewis had some mechanical failures that cost him points. The media suggested his celebrity lifestyle was affecting his performance, It wasn't true, but the narrative took hold. And your relationship during this time? We grew closer again, actually. Lewis needed family around him, people who knew the real him, not the public persona. Samantha smiled softly. We'd FaceTime late at night. Sometimes he wouldn't even talk about racing, just everyday things. A book he was reading, a documentary he'd watched. Was there a particular moment that stands out from this period? Christmas 2016, Samantha said without hesitation. Lewis surprised us all by coming home to England. No entourage, no cameras, just my brother, showing up at Mum's door with presents. Her eyes glistened with the memory. He spent 3 days with us, playing board games, watching movies, just being Lewis. Not Lewis Hamilton, Formula One driver. Did he discuss his career during this visit? Only once. Dad finally asked why he'd been so quiet on social media since losing the championship. Samantha smiled. Lewis just said, "I'm recalibrating." None of us knew what he meant then, but 2017 showed us. He came back stronger than ever. How so? Lewis won the 2017 and 2018 championships back-to-back. But it wasn't just about winning anymore. He started talking openly about his struggles with mental health, about the pressure of being in the spotlight. Samantha looked directly at Lewis. He was finding his voice, not just as a driver, but as a human being with a platform. And your relationship continued to strengthen? It did, but differently than before. We weren't just brother and sister sharing childhood memories anymore. We were adults supporting each other through life's challenges. Samantha's voice softened. Lewis was dealing with global fame and pressure I couldn't really understand, but he still made time to call when I was going through my own struggles. The prosecutor nodded. Ms. Hamilton, as we conclude this section about Lewis's championship, years with Mercedes, what would you say was the most significant change you observed in your brother during this time? Samantha considered carefully. Lewis learned that winning isn't everything. Don't misunderstand me. He's still the most competitive person I know. But he discovered that his legacy could be about more than trophies and records. She looked directly at her brother. The Lewis who entered Formula One wanted to be the best driver in the world. The Lewis who emerged through these championship years wanted to use that success to change the world. That's why what happened next matters so much. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time to move to the next phase of testimony. The judge nodded. We'll take a 15-minute recess, then continue. As the courtroom began to empty, Lewis remained seated. For the first time since the trial began, a faint smile played across his lips as he watched his sister step down from the witness stand. When court reconvened, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Several spectators who had arrived expecting scandal were now leaning forward with genuine interest. The story of the Hamilton siblings had captivated even the most cynical journalists in attendance. Samantha returned to the witness stand, appearing more confident than before. She smoothed her blazer and faced the prosecutor with renewed determination. Ms. Hamilton, the prosecutor began, I'd like to discuss a less visible aspect of your brother's career. Behind the victories and public appearances, Lewis was fighting. Battles that few people knew about. Can you tell the court about this? Samantha nodded. While Lewis was winning championships, he was also fighting a personal battle with the sport itself. Formula One has historically lacked diversity. Lewis was, and still is, the only black driver in the sport's history. How did this affect him throughout his career? It was always there, from his karting days, Samantha said. The looks, the whispers, the feeling of not belonging. Lewis had to work twice as hard to prove himself worthy of being there. She glanced at her brother. Lewis rarely discussed this publicly in his early career. He wanted to be known for his driving, not his race. But the experiences accumulated over time, being told to go back to your own country by Spanish fans, facing monkey chants at a test session in Barcelona, reading racist comments online. Lewis's expression remained neutral, but his jaw tightened visibly. When did Lewis begin to speak more openly about these experiences? Around 2019, Samantha replied. Lewis had achieved nearly everything in the sport. He had the security of his success behind him, and I think he realized his voice carried weight. The prosecutor handed Samantha a printed interview. This is from mid-2019. Lewis says, "I've been silent for too long. My success gives me a platform, and I intend to use it." What prompted this shift? Several things, Samantha said. Lewis had been reading extensively about civil rights leaders, about the power of speaking up, but there was also a specific incident that changed everything. Can you tell the court about that incident? Samantha nodded. Lewis received a letter from a young black boy who wanted to be a racing driver, but was being bullied at his karting track. The boy wrote that he was ready to quit because nobody who looks like me ever makes it. She paused, emotion evident in her voice. Lewis called me that night. I hadn't heard him so upset in years. He kept saying, "This was me, Sammy. This was exactly me 30 years ago." What did Lewis do in response to this letter? He invited the boy and his family to the British Grand Prix as his guests, showed him around the Mercedes garage, introduced him to the team. Samantha smiled at the memory. But more importantly, Lewis realized that his silence wasn't helping the next generation. That's when he truly began to speak out. And how was this activism received within Formula One? Mixed at first, Samantha admitted. Some teams and drivers supported him. Others suggested he was being divisive, that racing should be kept separate from politics. She leaned forward. What people didn't see was how much this took out of Lewis personally. He'd call me after facing backlash, questioning if it was worth the fight. But he never backed down. Did Lewis discuss creating more formal initiatives during this time? Yes. He told me he was working with Mercedes on diversity programs, but he wanted to do more. Samantha looked directly at her brother. He started mentoring young drivers from underrepresented backgrounds, quietly paying for their racing seasons when their families couldn't afford it. Was this public knowledge? No, Samantha shook her head. Lewis did this privately. He didn't want these kids to be labeled as Lewis's charity cases. He wanted them to be recognized for their talent, not who was supporting them. The prosecutor approached with another document. This is from early 2020, when Lewis began speaking out about environmental issues. The headline reads, "Hamilton, Hypocrite or Hero?" How did this criticism affect him? It hurt him deeply, Samantha said firmly. Lewis genuinely cares about these issues. He sold his private jet, switched to electric cars, adopted a plant-based diet. But every effort was met with, "You race cars for a living." She looked at the jury. What people didn't see was Lewis in his Monaco apartment, staying up until 3 a.m., researching sustainable technologies, reading environmental reports, trying to understand how he could make a difference. Did Lewis ever consider walking away from Formula One due to this contradiction? Many times, Samantha nodded. He confided in me during the pandemic lockdown. We spoke almost daily then. It was like having my brother back. He questioned whether he could continue in a sport that seemed at odds with his values. What kept him racing? The platform it gave him, Samantha said simply. Lewis realized he could do more good within the system than outside it. that his voice carried more weight as an active champion than it would as a retired driver. Lewis nodded almost imperceptibly from his seat. "Let's discuss 2020 more specifically," the prosecutor continued. This was when Lewis became more vocal about racial justice after the murder of George Floyd. How did this period affect him personally? Samantha's expression grew more serious. It was transformative. "Lewis called me the day after seeing the video. He was in tears, saying he couldn't stay silent anymore." She straightened her shoulders. "What followed was the most authentic version of my brother I'd seen in years." Lewis spoke without filters, without concern for sponsors or his public image. He marched in London protests. He challenged his fellow drivers to speak up. And the response from the Formula One community? Initially, there was pushback. Some fans told him to stick to driving. Some team principals suggested politics had no place in the sport. Samantha shook her head. What those critics didn't understand was that for Lewis, this wasn't politics. It was his lived experience. How did these attacks affect him? Lewis has developed thick skin over the years, but the constant criticism took a toll, Samantha said. There were nights he'd call me, questioning whether it was worth fighting these battles, whether anything would ever really change. She looked directly at her brother. One night, after particularly vicious online abuse, Lewis told me, "Sometimes I think about walking away from it all, Sammy, just disappearing from public life completely." Lewis's normally controlled expression slipped briefly, confirming the ikai truth of her words. But he didn't walk away, the prosecutor observed. "No," Samantha said proudly. Instead, he channeled that pain into action. He established the Hamilton Commission to research barriers to diversity in motorsport. He pushed Mercedes to change their car from silver to black in support of anti-racism. He created Mission 44, his charitable foundation, all while continuing to win championships. Yes, that's what people don't understand about Lewis, Samantha said, her voice filled with emotion. While fighting these battles publicly and dealing with the backlash, he was still performing at the highest level of his sport, still working harder than anyone else on track. The prosecutor approached with one final document for this section. This is from late 2021, after Lewis narrowly lost the championship to Max Verstappen in controversial circumstances. There was speculation he might retire. Can you tell the court about that period? That was the closest Lewis came to walking away, Samantha said quietly. Not because of losing. Lewis can handle defeat, but because he questioned whether the sport truly valued his voice, his presence. What happened during that time that most people don't know about? Samantha hesitated, glancing at Lewis, who gave her a subtle nod of permission. Lewis disappeared for almost a month. Even I didn't know where he was at first. She twisted her hands together. He eventually called me from a small monastery in Japan. He'd gone there to meditate, to find clarity. And what decision did he reach? He decided his work wasn't finished, Samantha said simply. Not just in racing, but in changing the sport itself, making it more inclusive, more sustainable. He returned with renewed purpose and a plan that went far beyond racing. The prosecutor nodded. Ms. Hamilton, as we conclude this section about your brother's activism, what would you say has been the most significant impact of his decision to speak out? Samantha looked directly at her brother, her eyes bright with pride. Lewis showed that athletes don't have to separate who they are from what they do. That champions can use their voices for more than promoting sponsors or celebrating victories. Her voice strengthened. But most importantly, he's changing the future. There are children karting today who might never have believed they belonged in motorsport, if not for my brother standing up and saying, "Yes, You do? The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time to move to our final phase of testimony. The judge nodded. Proceed. The prosecutor approached the witness stand with a tablet displaying video footage. Ms. Hamilton, I'd like to discuss the events surrounding the 2021 British Grand Prix at Silverstone. This race became a pivotal moment, not just in your brother's career, but in your relationship with him. Can you set the scene for the court? Samantha took a deep breath. Silverstone is special to British drivers, but for Lewis, it's always been more than just another race. It's home, the first major circuit he visited as a child, the place where he won his first British Grand Prix. What made the 2021 race particularly significant? It was the height of Lewis's championship battle with Max Verstappen, Samantha explained. The rivalry was intense. Mercedes was no longer the dominant team. Red Bull had the faster car, and Max was leading the championship. Vertrouwd. Prosecutor nodded. Can you describe what happened during the race? On the first lap, Lewis and Max were battling for the lead, Samantha said, her voice growing tense with the memory. Into Copse Corner, Lewis went for an overtake. The cars touched. Max's car left the track and hit the barrier at high speed. The prosecutor played a brief clip of the incident on the tablet. The courtroom watched in silence as the two cars made contact, followed by Verstappen's violent impact with the tire barrier. What was the immediate reaction to this collision? It was chaos, Samantha said. The race was red-flagged while medical. Teams attended to Max. He was taken to hospital for checks, though thankfully not seriously injured. She glanced down at her hands. During the delay, social media exploded. Red Bull's team principal was furious, claiming Lewis had made a desperate move. The stewards penalized Lewis for causing the collision, but he was still able to continue once the race restarted. And what happened in the remainder of the race? Despite the penalty, Lewis fought back through the field and won, Samantha said. It was his 8th British Grand Prix victory, a record. The British fans were ecstatic, but the atmosphere in the paddock was toxic. How did Lewis handle the aftermath? Publicly, he was measured. He expressed concern for Max, defended his racing move as legitimate, celebrated with the fans. Samantha's expression darkened. But what came next? No one was prepared for it. Please tell the court what happened. The backlash was immediate and vicious, Samantha said, her voice tight with emotion. Social media became a flood of abuse, directed at Lewis. Not just criticism of his driving, which would have been fair, but racist attacks, death threats, vile messages targeting his family. Lewis shifted in his seat, his normally composed face showing a flicker of remembered pain. Lewis has dealt with criticism throughout his career, Samantha continued, but this was different. The volume, the intensity, the hatred, it was overwhelming. How? Did you become aware of this situation? Lewis called me that night, Samantha said. His voice, I'll never forget it. He sounded exhausted, hollowed out. He told me not to look at social media, that it had gotten really bad. She twisted her hands together. But of course, I did look, and it was horrific. People using racial slurs, threatening violence against him, against our family. Some people even found my social media accounts and sent me hateful messages just for being his sister. How did Lewis respond to this abuse? Publicly, he stayed silent for a few days. Mercedes issued statements condemning the racism. Some drivers spoke up in support. Samantha shook her head sadly. But privately, Lewis was in a dark place. He told me it brought back every racist incident he'd ever experienced in racing. And how did you support him during this time? I tried to be there for him, called him daily, sent messages of support. Samantha's voice wavered slightly. But I was struggling too, seeing my brother attacked that way, dealing with threats myself. It affected me more than I realized at the time. The prosecutor approached with a printed document. This is a statement Lewis eventually released, condemning the racist abuse, but also calling for more action from social media platforms and from Formula One itself. What was the response to this statement? Mixed, Samantha said frankly. Some praised Lewis for speaking out. Others accused him of playing the race card to distract from the incident itself. Formula One and the FIA issued statements of support, but there was little concrete action. And how did this affect Lewis personally? He withdrew, Samantha said, became more guarded in interviews, posted less on social media. I could hear, in his voice during our calls, that something had changed. It wasn't just the abuse. It was the realization that despite all his success, all his championships, a significant portion of the racing world still saw him as an outsider. Was there a specific moment when this tension affected your relationship with Lewis? Samantha hesitated, glancing at her brother. Lewis gave her a slight nod, his eyes communicating permission to continue. About 2 weeks after Silverstone, I posted something on social media defending Lewis, she said quietly. It wasn't anything dramatic, just support for my brother, calling out the double standards in how he was being treated compared to other drivers. She looked down. Lewis called me that evening. He wasn't angry exactly, but concerned. He said I was making myself a target, that I didn't understand the full situation, that I should stay out of it. How did you respond? I got defensive, Samantha admitted. Told him I was just standing up for him like I'd always done, that I couldn't stay silent watching him be attacked. Her voice trembled slightly. The conversation escalated. I accused him of shutting me out, of becoming too controlled by his PR team. He said I didn't understand the pressure he was under, the responsibility he carried. What happened next? We both said things we didn't mean, Samantha said, emotion evident in her voice. I told him he'd forgotten where he came from, who had supported him when no one else would. He said I was using his name to get attention. She wiped away a tear. We'd argued before, of course. All siblings do. But this was different. We'd touched on insecurities, old wounds. When we hung up, I knew something had broken between us. From his seat, Lewis looked down, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Did you speak again soon after? No, Samantha shook her head. That was the beginning of the longest period we've ever gone without speaking. Almost 4 months of silence. No calls, no messages. How did that affect you? It was like losing a limb, Samantha said simply. Lewis has been a constant in my life since I was born, even when he was traveling the world racing, even during the difficult years with Dad. We'd always stayed connected. She looked directly at Lewis. I checked his social media obsessively, watched every race, read every interview, trying to glimpse how he was doing. But it wasn't the same as hearing his voice, knowing how he really felt behind the public persona. And how do you believe Lewis felt during this period? Isolated, Samantha said with certainty. Lewis has always needed family, needed that connection to his roots. The fame, the success, none of it replaces that. I think he was hurting as much as I was, but neither of us knew how to bridge the gap. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. What eventually broke the silence between you? Christmas, Samantha said, a small smile breaking through her tears. Dad called a family meeting, said he was tired of his children acting like strangers, told us both to be at his house on Christmas Eve, no excuses. And did you both attend? Yes, Samantha nodded. It was awkward at first, formal greetings, careful small talk. But then Nicholas, our younger brother, announced he had a surprise. He played a video he'd compiled, home movies from our childhood, Louis and me racing go-karts in the garden, birthday parties, family holidays. Her smile widened at the memory. Watching those videos, seeing who we had been to each other, the walls just fell away. By the end, Louis and I were both in tears. We talked until sunrise, really talked, about the Silverstone incident, about the pressure he was under, about my feelings of being shut out of his life. "And did you resolve your differences?" "We did," Samantha said, her voice strengthening. "Not perfectly. The hurt didn't disappear overnight. But we remembered what matters most. That before Louis was a champion, before I was his sister in the public eye, we were just Sammy and Louis, two kids from Stevenage who always had each other's backs." The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this would be a good time for our final recess before concluding Ms. Hamilton's testimony." The judge nodded. "We'll take 20 minutes, then resume for the final phase." As Samantha stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Louis's across the courtroom. This time, there was no guarded expression, no careful distance, just open acknowledgement of shared pain and healing, visible for all the court to see. When court reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere had transformed completely. What had begun as a potentially scandalous testimony had evolved into a compelling family narrative that captivated everyone present. Even the most cynical reporters had set aside their initial expectations, drawn into the authentic story of the Hamilton siblings. Louis had moved to sit in the first row behind his legal team, his usual reserve giving way to visible attentiveness as his sister returned to the witness stand. The prosecutor approached with renewed purpose. "Ms. Hamilton, we've heard about your childhood with Louis, his rise through racing, and some of the personal challenges you've both faced, but we haven't yet addressed why we're all here today. Can you explain to the court the nature of this case?" Samantha straightened her shoulders. "This is a case about online harassment, hate speech, and the responsibility of social media platforms to protect users from targeted abuse. And how did you become involved in this case?" "After what happened following the Silverstone incident, I couldn't stay silent anymore," Samantha said firmly. "The racist abuse Louis received wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. Death threats, violent imagery, messages targeting our entire family." She leaned forward. "I realized this wasn't just about Louis. Thousands of people face this kind of abuse daily. The difference is, Louis has resources and support. Many victims don't." "When did you decide to take legal action?" "About 8 months ago," Samantha replied. "I'd been doing advocacy work against online hate for almost a year by then, sharing my experiences, speaking at schools." She gestured toward a group of lawyers at the prosecution table. "I was approached by a coalition of anti-discrimination organizations who were building a test case against several social media platforms. They asked if I would be willing to testify about my experiences as Louis Hamilton's sister." "And what specifically are you testifying about today?" "Two things," Samantha said. "First, the reality of online racial abuse in sports and its impact on both the targets and their families. Second, the failure of social media companies to adequately protect users, despite their promises to do so." The prosecutor nodded. "How did Louis react when you told him you wanted to testify in this case?" Samantha glanced at her brother. "Initially, he was concerned. Louis is private by nature. He's had to be, given the scrutiny he's under. He worried that testifying would expose our family to more attention, possibly more harassment. What changed his mind?" "I'm not sure anything changed his mind exactly," Samantha said with a small smile. But Lewis has always respected my independence, my right to make my own choices. Once he understood how important this was to me, he supported my decision. The prosecutor approached with a document. This is your initial statement to investigators. You mentioned that you believe social media companies applied different standards to different users. Can you elaborate? Yes, Samantha said firmly. After Silverstone, thousands of racist comments were posted across various platforms. Many were reported by Lewis's fans, by Mercedes, by Lewis himself, yet most remained visible for days, some for weeks. She shook her head in frustration. Meanwhile, I've seen accounts suspended within hours for copyright violations or much less serious infractions. The message seemed clear. Protecting a black athlete from racist abuse wasn't a priority. Did any platforms respond adequately? A few took limited action after sustained public pressure, Samantha acknowledged. But it was reactive, not proactive. The damage was already done. The prosecutor nodded. Ms. Hamilton, some critics have suggested that public figures should simply expect a certain level of negative attention. How do you respond to that? Criticism is one thing, Samantha said firmly. Lewis has always accepted that as part of being a public figure. But racial abuse isn't criticism. Death threats aren't negative attention. No one should have to accept that, regardless of their profession or profile. And Lewis's perspective on this issue? Samantha glanced at her brother. Lewis has developed incredible resilience over the years. He's faced racism since he was 8 years old on karting tracks. But even he was shaken by the scale and intensity of what happened after Silverstone. She leaned forward. There's a cost to that resilience, a toll it takes. Lewis doesn't show it publicly, but I've seen it. The weight of constantly having to be stronger, more composed, more professional than everyone else, just to be treated with basic respect. Lewis's carefully maintained expression softened, a rare public glimpse of vulnerability from the champion. Ms. Hamilton, the prosecutor said, why is Lewis not testifying himself today? The question hung in the air. The courtroom fell completely, silent, all eyes moving between Samantha and Lewis. That was his choice, Samantha said carefully. Lewis has spent his career focused on racing, on being the best driver he can be. More recently, he's used his platform to promote diversity in motorsport, to speak out on issues that matter to him. She looked directly at her brother. But Lewis believes that sometimes staying in the fight means choosing your battles. He's supporting this case in his own way, while continuing the work he's already doing to create change within his sport. The prosecutor nodded. One final question before we move to your concluding statement. In your earlier testimony today, you mentioned that something Lewis did meant so much to you. Something that rebuilt what was broken. Can you tell the court what you were referring to? Samantha hesitated, looking to Lewis. He held her gaze steadily, then gave a slight nod. Permission to continue. After we reconciled following our argument, Lewis asked me to help him with something, Samantha said. He'd been working on a project in secret for almost 2 years, something no one in the public knew about. She paused, emotion visible on her face. Lewis asked if I would join him in this work, not as Lewis Hamilton's sister, but as a partner. He valued my voice, my perspective. And what was this project? Samantha smiled. That's not my story to tell, not fully. But what I can say is that Lewis found a way to turn his pain into purpose, to use his success to create opportunity for others. She looked directly at her brother. And most importantly, he remembered that changing the world starts with family, with healing what's broken, with standing together. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have one final portion of Ms. Hamilton's testimony, which will address her direct knowledge of Lewis Hamilton's undisclosed initiatives that are central to this case. The judge nodded. We'll proceed without further recess. As the prosecutor prepared her final questions, Samantha and Lewis maintained eye contact across the courtroom, no longer separated by fame or misunderstanding, but united in a shared purpose that was about to be revealed. The prosecutor approached the witness stand with renewed purpose, aware that the courtroom was hanging on every word. Ms. Hamilton, throughout your testimony, you've alluded to aspects of your brother's life and work that aren't publicly known. Can you tell the court what you've witnessed behind the scenes? Samantha took a deep breath, glancing once more at Lewis, who gave her an encouraging nod. Most people know Lewis Hamilton as a racing driver, a 7-time world champion, she began. Some know him as an activist who speaks out on diversity and inclusion. But very few know what he does when the cameras aren't watching. She straightened her shoulders. For the past 3 years, Lewis has been quietly mentoring young drivers from underrepresented backgrounds, not just offering advice, but personally funding their racing careers. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Can you elaborate on this program? The prosecutor asked. Lewis identifies talented young drivers who face barriers, financial, racial, social, that might prevent them from progressing in motorsport, Samantha explained. He provides not just funding for their racing seasons, but also connects them with engineers, trainers, and mental performance coaches from his own network. And how is this different from his public foundation, Mission 44? Mission 44 is Lewis's official charitable foundation, which is doing important work, Samantha clarified. But this mentorship program is entirely separate, funded directly from Lewis's personal accounts, managed without publicity or PR teams. She leaned forward, her voice earnest. What makes this different is how hands-on Lewis is. He spends hours reviewing these young drivers' race footage, providing feedback. He calls them before and after race weekends. During the off-season, he invites them to train alongside him. How many young drivers are part of this program? Currently, 12, Samantha replied, ages ranging from 10 to 19. They come from the UK, Europe, Africa, and South America. Different backgrounds, different circumstances, but all facing barriers that Lewis himself understands from experience. And the total financial commitment? Over £15 million of his own money so far, Samantha said quietly. Another, louder murmur swept through the courtroom. Lewis remained still, his expression carefully neutral despite being the subject of these revelations. Ms. Hamilton, why has Lewis kept this program completely private until now? He believes these young drivers should be judged solely on their talent, Samantha explained, not as Lewis Hamilton's projects or charity cases. He wants them to earn respect on their own terms, just as he had to. She glanced at her brother. Lewis knows firsthand how cruel the racing world can be, how quick people are to dismiss success, with comments like, he only got there because of who supported him, or it was handed to him. And your role in this program? I help coordinate between Lewis and the families, Samantha said. Many of these parents are sacrificing everything for their children's dreams, just like our father did. They need someone who understands that journey, who isn't intimidated by dealing with a global sports star. The prosecutor nodded. Ms. Hamilton, you've also mentioned Lewis's struggles with the mental health aspects of fame and racing. Can you tell the court about his work in this area? Few people know that Lewis has privately funded mental health resources for drivers across multiple racing categories, Samantha said. Not just Formula One, but the junior formulas, karting, even grassroots racing. She continued with growing confidence. After his own experiences with the pressures of the sport, Lewis quietly established a network of sports psychologists and counselors who are available to any driver who needs support, completely confidentially and free of charge. Why hasn't this initiative been made public? Lewis believes that seeking mental health support should be normalized, not publicized, Samantha explained. He doesn't want drivers to feel like accepting help is a PR opportunity or something to be celebrated. Just a normal part of being an athlete. The prosecutor approached with another document. This is a private email from the head of a major karting association, thanking Lewis for his transformative contribution to driver welfare. Can you explain what this refers to? After a young kart racer took his own life following online bullying, in 2019, Lewis was devastated, Samantha said, her voice softening. He reached out to the family privately and then worked with karting organizations to implement better safeguarding policies. She dabbed at her eyes. Lewis has experienced how brutal social media can be. He didn't want another young person to face that without support. Ms. Hamilton, these private initiatives show a different side of your brother than the public persona. Why is he willing to allow these details to be shared in court today? Samantha glanced at Lewis, who was watching her intently. Because this case matters more than his privacy, she said simply. Because the racist abuse after Silverstone wasn't just an attack on Lewis, it was an attack on every young person of color who dreams of following in his footsteps. She straightened her shoulders. Lewis has spent his career fighting these battles quietly, trying to change the system from within. But sometimes, the system needs to be challenged publicly. This court case is part of that challenge. The prosecutor nodded. One final question, Ms. Hamilton. Earlier, you stated that what you had to say about Lewis would change everything people think they know about him. What did you mean by that statement? Samantha looked directly at her brother, no longer the baby global superstar, but the boy from Stevenage who had shared her childhood. People think they know Lewis Hamilton, the racing driver, the fashion icon, the celebrity, she said, her voice clear and strong. They see the victories, the confidence, the carefully managed public image. She paused. What they don't see is the man who calls young drivers the night before their first big race to calm their nerves. The man who remembers the birthdays of his mechanics' children. The man who still feels like an outsider in his own sport sometimes, despite all his success. Her eyes never left her brother's face. Most of all, they don't see the Lewis who has never forgotten what it felt like to be the only black child at the karting track, and who has dedicated his life to ensuring no child feels that way again. Lewis's carefully maintained composure finally broke, emotion visible on his face as he listened to his sister's words. The Lewis Hamilton I know, Samantha concluded, has used his success not just to break records or win championships, but to silently build ladders for others to climb. That's what I wanted the world to know about my brother. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have no further questions for Ms. Hamilton at this time. The judge nodded. Defense counsel, your witness. As the defense attorney rose, Samantha maintained eye contact with Lewis across the courtroom. Between them passed an unspoken understanding that whatever questions came next, the truth had finally been spoken. The defense attorney approached the witness stand with measured steps. Unlike the aggressive posture many had expected, his demeanor was respectful, almost subdued. Ms. Hamilton, he began, thank you for your testimony today. I have just a few questions to clarify certain points. He glanced down at his notes. You've spoken about your brother's private initiatives to support young drivers and provide mental health resources. Can you confirm when these programs began? The mentorship program started after the 2019 season, Samantha replied. The mental health initiative began earlier, around 2017, but expanded significantly in 2020 during the pandemic. The defense attorney nodded. And these programs are entirely funded by Lewis personally, not through corporate sponsorships or his team. That's correct, Samantha confirmed. Lewis wanted complete control over these initiatives without external influence or publicity requirements. One more question about these programs, the attorney continued. Approximately how many hours per week would you estimate Lewis dedicates to these initiatives, particularly during the racing season? Samantha considered this. During the season, at least 10 to 15 hours weekly. Between races, it can be closer to 30 hours. Lewis reviews race footage of his mentees, has video calls with them, and coordinates with their coaches. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Even dedicated Formula One fans seemed shocked by this revelation about how their champion spent his limited free time. Ms. Hamilton, the defense attorney continued, earlier you mentioned that Lewis faced racist abuse throughout his career. To your knowledge, did he report these incidents to racing authorities? Yes, especially in the early years, Samantha said. Dad would file reports with the karting federations, later with the FIA. But the response was usually minimal, expressions of concern without meaningful action. Thank you for clarifying. The defense attorney paused, consulting his notes. Now, regarding the incident following the 2021 British Grand Prix at Silverstone, you testified about the racist abuse Lewis received on social media platforms. Were these platforms made aware of this abuse? Yes, Samantha said firmly. Thousands of users reported the comments. Mercedes's communications team submitted formal complaints. Lewis's management filed official reports with each platform, documenting hundreds of examples. And what was the response? Disappointingly inadequate, Samantha said. Some platforms took days to remove even the most explicit racist content. Many of the accounts responsible faced no consequences at all. The defense attorney nodded. No. Further questions, Your Honor. The judge turned to the prosecution. Any redirect? The prosecutor stood. Just one question, Your Honor. She approached the witness stand. Ms. Hamilton, throughout your testimony today, you've alluded to something Lewis has been planning that goes beyond these already significant private initiatives. Can you tell the court what that is? Samantha took a deep breath, looking directly at Lewis. He held her gaze steadily, then gave a single, decisive nod. Lewis has been developing a comprehensive racing academy, Samantha said, her voice strong and clear. Not just for drivers, but for engineers, mechanics, strategists, and team personnel from underrepresented backgrounds. The courtroom fell completely silent. This isn't just a scholarship program, Samantha continued. It's a complete alternative pathway into motorsport. Lewis has acquired land near Silverstone. He's designed facilities, developed curricula with education experts, recruited instructors from Formula One teams. She leaned forward. Lewis has committed over £70 million of his own money to build and operate this academy for the next decade. No sponsors, no corporate partnerships, just his personal funds. Gasps and whispers spread through the courtroom. Lewis remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving his sister. But the most significant aspect, Samantha said, her voice wavering slightly with emotion, is that Lewis plans to step away from racing to lead this academy personally, not as a figurehead, but as a full-time instructor and mentor. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Several journalists rushed out, presumably to file breaking news stories. The judge called for order, tapping his gavel firmly. Ms. Hamilton, The prosecutor asked when silence had been restored. Are you saying that Lewis Hamilton plans to retire from Formula One to run this academy? Yes, Samantha said simply. Lewis believes his greatest legacy won't be his championships, but the barriers he breaks down for the next generation. She looked directly at her brother, tears in her eyes. What most people don't understand about Lewis is that racing was never the end goal. It was the platform he needed to create real change. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. Your beef honor. The judge turned to Samantha. Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Hamilton. You are excused. As Samantha stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained unusually quiet, absorbing the magnitude of what had been revealed. She walked toward the gallery, her steps steady and confident. Lewis stood as she approached. Without hesitation, in full view of the court, he embraced his sister. It was a powerful image. The normally private, carefully composed champion openly, showing affection and gratitude. The prosecutor approached the bench. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call our next witness, Mr. Lewis Hamilton. Lewis released his sister, straightening his suit jacket as he moved toward the witness stand. His usual guardedness had fallen away, replaced by quiet determination. He was sworn in, his eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the journalists frantically typing, the social media executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the anti-racism advocates watching with hope in their eyes. Mr. Hamilton, the prosecutor began, would you please tell the court, in your own words, why you believe this case matters? Lewis leaned toward the microphone, his voice clear and resolved. I'm here today not as a racing driver, but as someone who understands the real harm that online hate causes. He glanced at his sister, drawing strength from her presence. For too long, I've fought these battles quietly, trying to create change from within systems that resist it. But some fights need to be public. Some truths need to be spoken aloud. His voice strengthened. This case isn't about me. It's about every young person who faces abuse based on their race, gender, or identity. It's about holding powerful platforms accountable for the environments they create and profit from. Lewis straightened his shoulders, speaking with the same intensity he brought to the racetrack. Most importantly, it's about making sure that the next generation doesn't have to develop the same thick skin I did. That they can pursue their dreams without facing the hatred I've encountered throughout my career. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Now, let's address the racing academy your sister mentioned. As Lewis began to detail his vision for transforming motorsport from the ground up, Samantha watched from the gallery, pride evident in her eyes. What had begun as a sensationalized court appearance had transformed into something profound. A platform for truths long kept private, and a blueprint for meaningful change. The headlines tomorrow would not be about scandal or controversy. They would declare to the world what Samantha had always known, that behind Lewis Hamilton's racing success lay a deeper purpose, one that would outlast any championship trophy and impact generations to come. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the life of one of Formula One's greatest champions, seen through the eyes of someone who knew him before the fame and glory. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know which part of the world this story has reached. If you enjoyed this emotional tale of family, sacrifice, and purpose beyond success, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Your support helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and opens minds. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family who might appreciate a deeper look at the human side of sports icons. Together, we can spread kindness and awareness about the real challenges and triumphs that happen behind the headlines. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.